300 Spartans, one narrow pass. An army so vast its arrows blot out the sun. It is one of those stories that feels too perfect to question. And for millions of people, the picture in their head comes from Hollywood. Leonidas and 300 bare-chested warriors standing alone between Greece and an endless Persian horde. But the moment you start checking the numbers, the picture changes. Because there were not 300 Greeks at Thermopylae. There were thousands. And when Leonidas stayed for the final stand, hundreds of men from other Greek cities stayed with him, some of them by choice, knowing exactly how the day would end. The other famous number is shaky too. Ancient sources give Xerxes an army in the millions. Modern historians do not take that figure literally. Then there is the betrayal. We are told a traitor revealed a secret mountain path, except Leonidas already knew the path existed and had put 1,000 men there to guard it. And there is one more problem with the legend. Thermopylae was not a Greek victory. Xerxes broke through, marched south, and Athens was later captured and burned. So what actually happened in 480 BC? How many Greeks were really there? How large was the Persian army? Why did the pass hold for 2 days? Why did it fail on the third? And how did a Persian victory become one of the most famous heroic stories in Western history? To answer that, we have to investigate the battle the way we would investigate a crime scene. Start with the witnesses, test the numbers, reconstruct the ground, and see which parts of the story survive the evidence. Our main witness is Herodotus, writing a few decades after the invasion. He gives us the fullest surviving account of Thermopylae, and he actually lists many of the Greek contingents. Leonidas brought 300 Spartan citizens, but they were only one part of the force. Herodotus also names troops from Tegea, Mantinea, the rest of Arcadia, Corinth, Phlius, and Mycenae. Then there were 700 Thespians, 400 Thebans, 1,000 Phocians, and a force from the Opuntian Locrians whose exact number he does not give. Add the contingents we can count, and you are already above 5,000. Once the Locrians and other attendants are considered, modern reconstructions usually put the Greek force at roughly 6,000 to 7,000 men at the start of the battle. That is a very different scene. Not 300 men against Asia, a coalition of several thousand Greeks defending a position chosen specifically to reduce the advantage of a much larger army. The 300 still mattered. They were Spartan citizens, selected by Leonidas, and Herodotus says each man had a living son. They were experienced troops, serving under a king whose presence gave the expedition enormous prestige. But even Sparta did not present this as its entire army. Herodotus says the force was sent ahead, while the Spartans observed the festival of the Carnea. Larger reinforcements were expected later. Other Greek states were also affected by the Olympic festival. So the first verdict is easy. The 300 were real. The idea that they were the only Greeks at Thermopylae is not. There is a catch. Almost everything we know about the battle comes through Greek sources, and Herodotus was not standing there with a notebook. He was born around the time of the invasion and wrote his histories decades later. He collected testimony, local traditions, family stories, and competing versions. Sometimes he tells us when he doubts a story. Sometimes he preserves details that read more like epic than field report. Take the famous line about Persian arrows blocking out the sun. Herodotus does record a Spartan, Dianekes, responding that in that case the Greeks would fight in the shade. Could the line be authentic? Possibly. Can we prove those exact words were spoken? No. And the even more famous reply, "Come and take them," does not appear in Herodotus at all. It is preserved by Plutarch, writing roughly 6 centuries later. That does not make the story worthless. It means we have to separate evidence by age and reliability. Herodotus is indispensable, but he is not a security camera. And nowhere is that more obvious than when he tells us how many Persians Xerxes brought with him. Herodotus gives Xerxes a land army of well over 1 million fighting men. Add sailors, servants, and camp followers, and the total becomes even more spectacular. Now try to move that army through northern Greece. Every man needs water, every day. The horses need more. Then come grain, fodder, pack animals, camps, roads, and the sheer length of the marching column. At a certain point, the number stops being impressive and starts becoming physically impossible to sustain. This does not mean Xerxes brought a small force. Far from it. The invasion was one of the largest and most carefully prepared military operations of the ancient world. The Persians bridged the Hellespont, dug a canal through the Athos Peninsula, organized supply depots, and moved a multinational imperial army into Europe. But there is no modern consensus on an exact headcount. Serious estimates range widely, from the tens of thousands into the low hundreds of thousands, because the evidence simply does not let us count the army man by man. The safe conclusion is more useful than a fake precision. Xerxes massively outnumbered the defenders, but the ancient 7-figure totals are not credible, which leaves the real tactical question. If the Persians had such a large advantage, why could they not simply overwhelm the Greeks? Because Thermopylae was chosen to make numbers matter less. Thermopylae means the hot gates, after the thermal springs in the area. The landscape today is deceptive. Over the last 2,500 years, sediment has pushed the shoreline outward. In 480 BC, the sea came much closer to the mountain. The road south was squeezed between steep ground and the Malian Gulf, narrowing sharply at several points. The Greeks also repaired an old Phocian wall and used it as part of their defensive position. This is the part of the battle that the movie gets right in spirit. The terrain was the weapon. Xerxes could bring more men to Greece, but he could not bring all of them into the front line at once. Cavalry had little room to maneuver. Large formations could not simply wrap around the defenders. The Persians had to attack through a restricted frontage. Greek hoplites were heavy infantry. Their large shields, long spears, and close formation were built for a head-on contest. The Spartans were exceptionally well drilled, but Herodotus says the allied contingents also took turns in the fighting. That detail matters. For the first 2 days, Thermopylae was not a solo performance by Sparta. It was a coalition defense using terrain, discipline, and rotation to absorb repeated Persian attacks. The position held. Then, a local man named Ephialtes went to the Persians with information that changed the battle. The betrayal is real. The secret path is where the story gets interesting. Ephialtes told Xerxes about a mountain route, the Anopeia path, that could take Persian troops around the Greek position. He then guided a force under the Persian commander Hydarnes through the mountains at night. That much comes directly from Herodotus. But here is the detail the legend usually leaves out. Leonidas already knew the path existed. In fact, he had stationed 1,000 Phocians on the mountain to guard it. So the mystery changes. The question is no longer, how could Leonidas defend a path he did not know about? The question is, how did the Persians get through a route the Greeks were already guarding? Herodotus says the Phocians heard the Persians approaching near dawn, the sound of feet in dry leaves giving them away. The Phocians rushed to arm themselves. Hydarnes initially feared he had encountered Spartans. Then the Persians fired volleys of arrows. The Phocians withdrew uphill, apparently expecting the attack to turn against them. Hydarnes did not follow. He did not need to defeat the Phocians. He only needed to get past them. The Persian column continued down the mountain toward the rear of Leonidas's position. Ephialtes mattered enormously, but he did not reveal a magical back door that nobody knew existed. The route was known. It was guarded. The guard failed to block it, and the Persians executed a successful night march around the defense. By morning, the Greek position was finished. Once Leonidas learned that the Persians were coming down behind him, most of the Greek force left the pass. Herodotus preserves more than one explanation. Perhaps the allies chose to withdraw because the position was hopeless. Perhaps Leonidas ordered them away to save them. He also connects Leonidas's decision to a Delphic prophecy that Sparta would either be destroyed or lose a king. We cannot know exactly what was in Leonidas's mind that morning, but we can ask a simpler question. Who stayed? First, the Spartans, by then fewer than the original 300 because of earlier losses and absences. Then 700 Thespians under their commander Demophilus. Herodotus is explicit about them. The Thespians stayed willingly. They refused to leave Leonidas and remained for the final fight. Think about what that does to the famous story. If Thermopylae is supposed to be the ultimate example of 300 men choosing certain death, then another 700 men made essentially the same choice, and most people cannot name their city. Around 400 Thebans also remained. Here the evidence is murkier. Herodotus says Leonidas kept them as hostages because Thebes was suspected of sympathy with Persia. Modern historians are cautious because Thebes was politically convenient to blame after the war. Some of those men may have stayed under compulsion. Some may have stayed for other reasons. We do not know. And there was another group the heroic version almost never shows. Helots, the unfree population whose labor underpins Spartan society. Herodotus later refers to helot bodies among the dead, although their exact number and role at Thermopylae remain debated. So on the last day, Leonidas was not surrounded by 300 Spartans in empty space. He was surrounded by Spartans, 700 Thespians, roughly 400 Thebans, and other men whose names and numbers were never preserved with the same care. The 300 were real. They were not alone. With the encirclement closing, the final battle became something very different from the first 2 days. Herodotus says the remaining Greeks moved forward into a wider part of the pass and fought with the knowledge that they were unlikely to escape. Leonidas was killed. The Greeks and Persians fought over his body. 2 brothers of Xerxes died in the fighting. As the Persian force from the mountain closed in, the defenders were pushed back toward the old wall and a small hill behind it. Spears broke. The formation collapsed. Herodotus describes men fighting with swords, then with whatever they had left. Eventually, the defenders were overwhelmed by missile fire and numbers. And this is the part no amount of heroic music can change. Persia won the Battle of Thermopylae. The pass was open. Leonidas was dead. The surviving defenders were destroyed or captured. Xerxes had achieved his immediate objective. Herodotus says Xerxes then ordered Leonidas' head cut off and his body displayed on a stake, an unusually harsh treatment that suggests just how much resistance had angered him. Thermopylae was a magnificent last stand. It was also a military defeat. This is where the legend makes its final move. The usual version says the sacrifice bought the time Greece needed to survive. There is some truth in that. The defense at Thermopylae was coordinated with Greek naval operations at Artemisium, and the delay disrupted the Persian timetable. The stand also became an extraordinary symbol of resistance. But if we test the claim literally, Thermopylae did not stop the invasion. After the pass fell, Xerxes marched south. The Athenians evacuated their city. Persian forces occupied Athens and burned the sanctuaries on the Acropolis. The campaign turned later at sea. At Salamis, the Greek fleet defeated the Persian navy in confined waters, where, once again, geography helped neutralize Persian numerical strength. In 479 BC, the remaining Persian land force in Greece was defeated at Plataea. So Greece was not saved by one king, one city, or one last stand. It was saved, if we want to use that word, by a fragile coalition that survived long enough to win later battles. Thermopylae mattered. It cost the Persians time and men. It gave the alliance a story about courage and loyalty. But it did not win the war. Which leaves us with the most interesting question of all. If the Persians won at Thermopylae, why do we remember the battle as Leonidas' triumph? Because the myth of the 300 is much older than Hollywood. The Greeks themselves turned Thermopylae into a story about obedience, sacrifice, and honor. Memorials reduced a complicated coalition battle to a handful of unforgettable images. Later writers polished the dialogue. Modern politics turned the Persian Wars into a clean confrontation between free Greece and despotic Asia. A contrast that becomes awkward once you remember that Sparta itself depended on an unfree helot population. Then, comics and cinema took a story that had already been edited for 2,000 years and pushed every contrast to its limit. That is why the biggest historical distortion in 300 is not the monsters. It is not Xerxes' costume. It is not even the impossible physiques. It is the empty battlefield around Leonidas. The historical picture is messier and better. Roughly 6,000 to 7,000 Greeks defended the pass at the beginning. The 300 were the Spartan citizen contingent, not the entire army. Xerxes' force was enormous, but the ancient million-man totals are not credible. The mountain path was not unknown, it was guarded. On the final day, 700 Thespians stayed voluntarily, around 400 Thebans remained under disputed circumstances, and helots were also among the dead. And when the fighting ended, Persia held Thermopylae and marched on. So did Hollywood lie? If by Hollywood we mean the version of Thermopylae most people now carry in their heads, yes, that version is historically false. But Hollywood did not invent the lie. It inherited a legend and made it louder. 300 Spartans really were there. Leonidas really did die. Their courage does not need to be invented. The correction is simpler than the myth. They were never alone, and they did not win the battle. What they won was something stranger. They won the memory of it. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe, leave a like, and share it with your friends. It really helps support the channel and allows me to keep making more history videos like this.